Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The cart from Harrogate reached Aldermoor at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon in June, which was later than Edith Shaw had expected and earlier than she had feared, the journey having taken the better part of the day over roads that improved and worsened by turns, as roads in this part of the North Riding tended to do when they were left to their own seasonal judgment, rather than the consistent attention of a maintenance crew with sufficient resources. She had not been to Aldermoor before. This was not unusual. She had not been to most of the places she knew about, having lived in Leeds for the first 36 years of her life, with the exception of a year in Halifax at 22 that had not been particularly formative and which she rarely mentioned. Leeds was a city she knew well, had taught in for 8 years at 2 different schools, and had found adequate in all the ways that mattered and insufficient in 1 or 2 ways that she had not been able to name precisely until the posting to Aldermoor arrived on her desk in March, and she had looked at it for a long time before saying yes. The posting had been for a replacement teacher. The previous teacher at Aldermoor Village School had been taken ill in November of the previous year and had not returned. The school had been managed intermittently through the winter by a retired schoolmaster from a neighbouring village who could come twice a week and no more, which was not sufficient for the school's 14 pupils, but was what had been available. The board had advertised in March, and Edith had applied and had been offered the position with less delay than she had expected, which she took to mean either that she was an excellent candidate or that no one else had applied and did not examine the question too closely. The cart stopped at the lane's end, and the driver handed down her trunk and her smaller bag and pointed at the building visible perhaps 200 yards away, the school building, she understood from the letter of appointment, which also served as the teacher's accommodation, a common enough arrangement in villages of Aldermoor's size, where the school and the teacher's rooms occupied the same stone building, and the teacher's daily life and professional life were therefore conducted in the same place and were not entirely separable. She picked up her smaller bag and began walking. The school building was what the letter had described: stone, low, 2 windows on the south face, a door at the east end, a small outbuilding behind for fuel and storage. The stonework was the particular grey of North Yorkshire stone that she associated with permanence and solidity rather than cheerfulness, and which she had heard described as forbidding by people who had not grown up near it. She did not find it forbidding. She found it simply what it was, which was old stone that had been here longer than anyone currently living could remember, and would continue to be here after all of them were gone. She found the key under the flat stone beside the door, exactly where the letter had said it would be. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The schoolroom was cool and still and smelled of chalk and old wood and something she could not immediately identify, but that she would come to recognize as the particular smell of a room that has been used intensively by children for many years and has absorbed this use into its surfaces and cannot quite release it, even when the children are absent. She set her bag down and looked at the room. The schoolroom occupied most of the building's ground floor. It was not large. She had taught in smaller rooms and in much larger ones, and this one fell in the comfortable middle range, the kind of space that could accommodate 14 children without feeling crowded and would not, by the same token, swallow a small group of 5 or 6 in the way that rooms built for a larger population sometimes swallowed small groups, making the few seem diminished by the empty surrounding space. There were 6 benches, each accommodating 2 or 3 children, arranged in the pattern she recognized as standard for village schools of this period, 2 rows facing the teacher's desk. The benches graduated in height for the age range, the smallest bench nearest the front for the youngest pupils. Her father had sat on exactly this kind of bench in a village school, not unlike this one, though his had been in the West Riding and a generation earlier, and he had described it to her when she was training as a teacher, with the particular nostalgia of someone describing the specifics of an experience that was in some ways uncomfortable and in other ways more formative than comfort could have been. The teacher's desk was at the front, south-facing, positioned between the 2 windows so that the teacher's face was lit from both sides by the same light that fell on the pupils' work. This was good positioning. She had seen teachers' desks placed against walls in ways that created glare problems, the teacher working in silhouette against a bright window while the children faced both the teacher and the light. Whoever had positioned this desk had understood something practical about classroom light. On the desk, a ledger. She opened it and found the record of the previous teacher's work, the attendance registers, the lesson notes, the quarterly assessments, the letters to the board. The handwriting was neat and consistent, with the particular quality of someone who had written the same kinds of entries in the same format for a long time and had found, through repetition, the most economical way to do it. The name at the top of the first page, dated September 1845, was Miss A. Greenwood. 30 years of entries. She turned through them slowly, September 1845 to November 1875, when the entries stopped. The last entry was dated the 14th of November and noted, in the same neat hand as everything preceding it, 14 pupils present, arithmetic and reading, weather cold, children attentive. The entry after the 14th of November was blank. She closed the ledger and looked around the room again. A bookshelf on the north wall with the standard texts, the readers, the arithmetic primers, a geography volume, a history of England that she had seen in every school she had ever worked in, a map of the British Isles on the wall, faded at the edges, a blackboard on a stand, the chalk dust of many thousands of lessons worked into the wood of the frame, a clock on the wall above the door, ticking. She needed to begin a new ledger entry. This was the first practical task, the documentation of her arrival, the formal beginning of the record under her name. She found blank paper in the desk drawer and wrote the date, the 1st of June, and her name, and noted that she had arrived and found the school in adequate condition and would begin classes on Wednesday, giving herself Tuesday for preparation. Then she went to find the teachers' rooms. They were through the door at the back of the schoolroom, as the letter had described. A kitchen with a small stove, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a door she had not been told about, set into the north wall of the city. The storage space was not large, perhaps 6 feet by 8, with shelving on 3 sides and a small window high on the north wall that admitted enough light to see by without providing the quality of light needed for any work that required precision. It smelled of old paper and dust, and the particular dryness of a space that had been closed for some months. She stood in the doorway and looked at the shelving. Books, not the standard texts from the schoolroom shelf, not the readers and the primers and the geography volume. These were different. She could see this from the doorway without going in, the books on the storage room shelves being of a kind that did not belong in the category of published schoolroom materials. They were handmade, she understood, as she stepped closer and took one from the shelf. The covers made of folded cardstock, the pages sewn together at the spine in the way that was not a bookbinder's work, but a careful amateur's work, the kind of binding that someone who understood the principle but not the professional technique would produce. The book in her hand was perhaps 40 pages, covered in the same neat handwriting as the schoolroom ledger. She looked at the shelf more carefully. The books were arranged in order. She could see this from the dates written on the spines in ink, small but legible. The earliest was dated 1845. The most recent was dated 1875. Between them, one book for each year, 30 volumes in a sequence that began in the year Miss Greenwood had started teaching at Aldermoor and ended in the year she had stopped. She took the 1845 volume and carried it to the sitting room and sat in the chair by the window. The first page said, in the same neat hand, "This is a record of Aldermoor." Not the official record. The official record is in the school ledger and the parish register and the various documents that official records require. This is the other record, the record of what the official record does not contain, which is considerable. She turned to the second page. Miss Greenwood had written about the village, not in the way of a history, not with dates and events and the formal apparatus of historical account, in the way of someone who had been paying very close attention to a specific place for a long time and wanted to write down what the attention had produced. She had described the school's first week in September 1845, the 7 children who had appeared on the first day, their names, their ages, the things they had already known and the things they had not, the particular quality of the September light in the schoolroom in the afternoon when the sun came through the south windows at the angle it came through in September and not in any other month. Edith read for half an hour without moving from the chair. She had not expected this. She had expected the storage room to contain spare chalk and old primers and the accumulated minor debris of a school that had been operating for 30 years. She had not expected 30 volumes of careful observation, 1 per year, recording things that official records did not record. She put the 1845 volume back on the shelf in the storage room and looked at the 30 volumes in their sequence. She would read them. This was clear to her from the moment she understood what they were. She would read them in order, beginning with 1845 and ending with 1875, which was the last volume and which she had not yet opened, but which she understood from the date and from what she knew of Miss Greenwood's departure would tell her something about how the 30 years had ended. But she would begin at the beginning. She met Mrs. Cross on Tuesday morning. She had gone into the village, Aldermoor's centre, which was a small green with a church on the north side and a cluster of stone houses around the remaining 3 sides, the whole thing compact and self-contained in the way of villages that had been in this specific location for so long that the relationship between the buildings and the land had stopped being a design decision and become simply the way things were. She had gone for bread and to introduce herself to whoever she encountered. the introduction of a new teacher being the kind of social activity that Edith had learned across 8 years of teaching in Leeds was best managed promptly and directly, rather than allowed to proceed through the gradual and imprecise mechanism of rumour. Mrs. Cross was in the garden of the stone house immediately adjacent to the church, doing something to a rose bush with the competent, unhurried attention of someone for whom garden work was not a leisure activity, but simply one of the things that needed doing and that she was doing. She was 71 years old, which Edith learned later, though she would have estimated something in that range from the quality of her face and movements, the face showing a great many years without appearing diminished by them, the movements having the economy of someone who had been managing their physical resources carefully for a long time and had become, through this management, more efficient rather than less capable. She looked up when Edith came through the gate and said, "You'll be the new teacher." Edith confirmed this. Mrs. Cross set down her tool and looked at Edith with the particular attention of someone assessing a new acquaintance and not particularly troubled about whether the assessment was apparent. She said, "You're younger than I expected." Edith said she was 36, which she thought was not particularly young for a teacher. Mrs. Cross said it was younger than Agnes Greenwood when she arrived. Agnes Greenwood had been 42 when she came to Aldermoor, she said, which meant she had been older than you are now when she started, and she was here for 30 years, so age isn't a prediction of anything. Edith asked whether she had known Miss Greenwood. Mrs. Cross said she had known her rather better than that. She had known her for 30 years, which was a different kind of knowing from knowing. She said this without elaboration, as though the distinction between knowing someone and knowing them for 30 years was sufficiently obvious to require no explanation, which Edith thought was probably fair. She asked whether she might visit Mrs. Cross sometime during the week, as she had found some materials in the school storage room that she wanted to ask about. Mrs. Cross looked at her with the expression of someone who knows what materials are being referred to and has been waiting to see how long it would take the new teacher to ask about them. She said, "Come Thursday, after 4 o'clock. Edith said she would. She bought bread from the woman in the house on the east side of the green and walked back to the school along the lane, which was in full June condition, the hedgerows dense and green, the verges with their long summer grass, the stone walls on either side holding the particular warmth of stone that has been in the sun all morning. She spent Tuesday preparing the schoolroom. She arranged the texts on the shelf. She wrote the names of the 14 expected pupils in the new ledger. She sharpened the chalk, and in the evening after supper she went to the storage room and took down the 1846 volume and sat in the chair by the sitting room window in the June evening light and read. The 1846 volume was different from the 1845 volume in the way that second years were always different from first years. The first year having the quality of someone still learning what they were doing and making it visible in the doing. The second year showing what the first year had taught and proceeding from that ground with more assurance. In 1846, Miss Greenwood had found her form. The 1845 volume had been finding it. The writing had been good from the beginning, the observation precise, and the expression careful, but there had been in 1845 a quality of uncertainty about what the books were for, what they were recording and why, that had resulted in entries that were sometimes longer than they needed to be and sometimes shorter, the calibration not yet established. By 1846 she had calibrated. The 1846 entries were of a consistent length and followed a loose seasonal structure. The school year providing the organizing principle, the autumn term and the spring term, and the brief summer sessions that village schools offered when the agricultural calendar permitted. But the structure was loose, in the way of something that served the content rather than constraining it, the entries departing from the seasonal pattern when something required departing from it and returning when they could. She had written, in the October 1846 entry, "The village has a way of teaching that the school does not. I do not mean this as a criticism of the school. I mean it as an observation about what the village knows that cannot be entered in the formal record." Yesterday, Thomas Birch's grandfather showed the older boys how to read the weather from the way the rooks behaved over Aldermoor Fell at dusk. This is knowledge that Thomas's grandfather has, and that Thomas's grandfather's grandfather had, and that the books I have on the schoolroom shelf do not contain, and could not contain, because it is knowledge that lives in the watching rather than in the being told. I have begun to write it down here because I do not know what else to do with it. Edith set the book down and looked at the June evening outside the sitting room window. The fell was visible from here, the long dark shape of Aldermoor Fell to the northwest, the June evening sky above it pale and clear. She had not yet been up to the fell. She had been here 2 days and had not gone further than the village. She thought about Thomas Birch's grandfather and the rooks at dusk and the knowledge that lived in the watching. She thought about what it meant to be a teacher in a village school, to be the person responsible for what the books contained while the village went on containing what the books could not. Miss Greenwood had understood this from the second year. She had begun writing down what the books could not contain, and she had continued for 30 years. Edith read through the rest of the 1846 volume and then sat with it closed in her lap for a while, thinking about the 14 pupils she had not yet met, who would arrive on Wednesday morning and bring with them what they knew, which would be the combination of what the books had given them and what the village had given them, the two kinds of knowledge running together in them, in the way that two kinds of water ran together when they met in a beck. She would begin classes in the morning and she would find out what they knew. They arrived at 8 o'clock in the way of children who have been told to arrive at 8 o'clock and have done so with the particular quality of obedience that is not enthusiasm and not reluctance, but simply the enactment of an instruction that has been delivered with sufficient clarity. 14 of them. She had their names from the previous ledger. She had read through the last several years of Miss Greenwood's attendance records, noting which names recurred and which were new, getting a sense of the school's population and its continuity. Several of the older pupils had been in the school since Miss Greenwood's last years. The youngest had arrived only the previous autumn and would not have known Miss Greenwood at all. Boo her. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them, and they looked at her. She said, "Good morning. My name is Miss Shaw. I have come from Leeds. I am going to be your teacher from now on." Several of the older children nodded. Several of the younger ones simply looked. One small girl in the front row, she identified her from the ledger as Mary Baines, age 6, first year, was looking at her with the complete and unblinking attention of someone for whom this was the most interesting thing that had happened in some time. She said, "I want to begin this morning by asking you each to tell me one thing you know that you think I don't know. It doesn't have to be about reading or arithmetic. It can be anything." This produced the silence she had expected. The silence not of having nothing to say, but of recalibrating the expected form of a lesson, because this was not the expected form of a lesson and the recalibration required a moment. Then a boy of approximately 10 in the second row said, "I know how to tell when it's going to rain tomorrow by looking at the clouds over the fell tonight." She said, "Tell me." He told her. It was more complex than she had anticipated, not a single observation but a system of observations, the cloud height and the cloud type and the direction from which the wind was moving them, all combined into an assessment that he described with the confidence of someone who had been learning it for some time and had tested it enough to trust it. He was not inventing, and he was not simplifying. He was telling her something he actually knew. She wrote it in her notebook. The lesson that followed was a reading lesson and an arithmetic lesson, both standard, both delivered in the standard way. She was not trying to transform the school on the first day. She was trying to understand what she had and begin building from it. She moved through the reading groups with attention, noting who was fluent and who was working and who was struggling in ways that needed specific attention. She noted the arithmetic work and found it, generally, at the level she had expected from Miss Greenwood's records. After the children left at 3 o'clock, she sat at the desk and wrote the first entry of the new regime in the school ledger. 14 pupils, reading and arithmetic, weather fine. She paused and then added, Thomas Birch explained the method of reading tomorrow's weather from tonight's cloud conditions over Aldermoor Fell. I have noted the method separately. She thought about Thomas Birch's grandfather's grandfather and what he had known, and she was beginning to understand what kind of school she had come to. Mrs. Cross's kitchen was the kind of kitchen that had been doing the same things for a very long time, and had the quality of a room that has been used to its purpose so thoroughly that the purpose and the room had become the same thing. Edith arrived at 4 o'clock and was given tea and a chair at the kitchen table without ceremony, Mrs. Cross moving between the table and the stove with the economy of someone who had been managing a kitchen for 50 years and did not require additional motion to perform any task within it. She asked about the books, not what was in them. She understood from the way Mrs. Cross had responded on Tuesday that Mrs. Cross already knew what was in them. She asked whether Mrs. Cross had known Miss Greenwood was writing them. Mrs. Cross said she had known. She had known since the 2nd or 3rd year, when Agnes had mentioned the books to her, had said, apparently, that she was writing down things she was observing, because she didn't want them to be lost, and she didn't know what else to do with them. Mrs. Cross had said that seemed reasonable, and Agnes had agreed that it did, and they had not discussed it extensively after that, but Mrs. Cross had understood that the books existed and had known approximately what they contained without having read them. Edith asked whether she had read them. Mrs. Cross said no. She had been offered them, she said, when Agnes left in November. Agnes had said she was leaving them in the storage room and that the new teacher could do what they liked with them. Mrs. Cross had said she didn't think she needed to read them, having been present for most of what they described. This was delivered without sentiment, simply as the reason, and Edith accepted it as such. She asked about Miss Greenwood herself, not the teacher. She was getting to know the teacher through the books, the person. Mrs. Cross was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone selecting from a large amount of available material the portion that was most relevant and most accurately representative. She said, Agnes Greenwood came here at 42 and stayed for 30 years. She could have gone to a larger school. She had the ability for it. She chose to stay here. She said once, this was perhaps 15 years ago. She said she had found what she was looking for and she wasn't inclined to go looking elsewhere. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, and I believed her and still do. Edith asked what she had been looking for. Mrs. Cross looked at her steadily. I don't know that Agnes could have said exactly, she said, but I think it was this, what this place is, the continuation of it. The children coming through year after year and taking what the school gave them and what the village gave them and going on, and the school being here when the next ones came. She was part of that. She cared about that more than she cared about most things I could name. She left Mrs. Cross at 5:30 and walked back to the school through the June evening. The rooks were coming in over the fell in the way that Thomas Birch had described, and she looked at them and tried to read the clouds behind them and thought she could see what he had meant, though she was not yet certain. She read one book per evening. This was the pace she had settled into by the end of the first week, not the fastest pace available, the books being short enough that she could have read 2 or 3 in an evening if she had treated them as information to be extracted rather than as something to be received. But she had understood from the first evening that extracting was the wrong approach. These were not reference texts. They were observations, and observations required a different quality of reading, slower, more receptive, willing to stop and think rather than pressing on to the next piece of information. She read the 1850 volume on a Friday evening in the second week. By 1850, Miss Greenwood's form had fully developed, the seasonal structure more assured, the entries more confident in their movement between the official and the unofficial, the book and the village. She had written about the older pupils with a particular depth of understanding that came from having taught children through multiple years and watching what the years did to them. She had written, "I have had William Carver in school for 4 years now. When he arrived at age 7, he could not read. He can read well now, not brilliantly, but well, which is an honest and useful kind of reading that will serve him throughout his life. But I notice that in these 4 years, the things he knows that the books don't contain have not diminished. They have increased. He knows more about the stone walls of this parish than I will ever know, having been watching his father rebuild them since he could walk. He knows things about sheep that are not in any text I have on my shelf. The question I have been sitting with this year is what a school owes to these 2 kinds of knowledge, the kind the books contain and the kind they do not, and whether owing to one necessarily diminishes the other, or whether there is a way to hold both. Edith had been sitting with a version of this question herself in the 2 weeks since arriving at Aldermoor. She had been trained in the standard curriculum, and she believed in the standard curriculum. The literacy and the numeracy and the history and the geography were real things that the children needed and that the school existed to provide. But she had also been watching the children across 2 weeks of lessons and had been noting, as Miss Greenwood had noted 60 years earlier in her own development as a teacher, that what the children brought to the schoolroom from outside it was not nothing, was in fact substantial, and was not always related to what the curriculum required them to learn. Thomas Birch had explained to her the method of reading weather from the fell. Mary Baines had described, in the course of a geography lesson that had strayed in an unexpected direction, the exact sequence of things her grandmother did when preparing for winter, a sequence that encompassed the preservation of food and the management of heating and the specific organization of the household that made the difference between a winter that was endured and a winter that was managed. Neither of these things was in any text on the schoolroom shelf. She kept her own notebook alongside the school ledger. When something like this came up in lessons, she wrote it down. She was not certain yet what she would do with these notes. She was writing them because not writing them felt like allowing something to slip away, and the not allowing was instinctive rather than deliberate. She thought about Miss Greenwood arriving at the same instinct in 1845 and continuing it for 30 years. By the 3rd week she had established the rhythm of the school day. Reading first, in the morning when the children were freshest, the 3 reading groups working through their texts while she moved between them, attending to each group in turn. Arithmetic second, before noon, the older children working independently while she worked with the younger ones, the arithmetic progressing at the pace that each child's particular development permitted, rather than the pace that the curriculum suggested was appropriate for their age, these two paces being not always the same. History and geography in the afternoons, which she taught to the full group, finding these the subjects most amenable to the kind of observation that Miss Greenwood had described in the 1850 volume. The places where what the children brought from outside the schoolroom met what the books contained, and the meeting produced something more than either alone. She was teaching a geography lesson on the rivers of England when Joseph Hartley, who was 11 and had been in the school for 4 years, said, "Does it say anything in the book about how the beck changes after heavy rain?" She said, "What do you mean?" He described it. How Aldermoor Beck, which ran through the valley below the village, changed its character in the days after heavy rain. The specific changes, the color of the water and the speed of it, and the way the banks responded, and what the fish did, and how long it took to return to its usual character. He described it with the precision of someone who had been watching the same beck for his entire life, which he had. She did not know how to put this in the formal context of a geography lesson. She said, "Let's continue with the lesson now and come back to this." She meant it. She wrote it in her notebook during the lunch interval and thought about how to come back to it in a way that connected it to what the curriculum required, without either ignoring it or being falsely systematic about it. She thought about Miss Greenwood's question from 1850, what a school owes to the two kinds of knowledge, whether owing to one diminishes the other. She had been thinking about this question from her own angle since arriving. She had come from Leeds with 8 years of urban school teaching, and in Leeds the question had a different quality. The children in Leeds brought things from outside the classroom that were also mostly inside the curriculum, or adjacent to it, the city being a place where the books world and the lived world overlapped more readily than they did in a village where a boy had been watching the same beck for 11 years and knew things about it that no geography textbook would ever contain. She wrote to Miss Greenwood's standard without yet knowing Miss Greenwood's approach. She was finding the approach herself in the specific conditions of this specific school and finding that it was converging on something similar. Not because she had been trained for this kind of school. She had not been specifically, but because the school made the convergence available and she was paying attention. The beck entry in her notebook grew across the afternoon as she thought about how to use it. By evening she had a plan for a lesson that she thought would work. She read the 1855 volume that evening. Miss Greenwood had been at Aldermoor for 10 years by then, and the 1855 volume had the quality of deep familiarity, the writing more assured than ever, the observation more layered, the entries moving between levels of detail, with the confidence of someone who had been paying attention to the same things for long enough that the attention had become its own form of knowledge. On her Monday to it, she climbed the fell on a Saturday in her 3rd week. She had been meaning to do this since arriving, and had not done it, the first 2 weeks having been sufficiently full of the school and the books and the village and Mrs. Cross that the fell had remained where it was, and she had not yet gone to it. Saturday provided the opportunity. No school, the morning clear and mild, the kind of June morning that was warm enough to be pleasant on high ground without being so warm that the climb would be more effort than it was worth. The path up began at the north end of the village and climbed steadily for the better part of an hour, the stone walls giving way to the open fell ground above the last wall, where the path became less obvious but remained followable, the line of it visible in the way that paths on grass became visible when enough feet had passed over them to create a subtle difference in the vegetation that lasted longer than any individual passage. She was not a habitual fell walker. She had grown up in Leeds and had walked as people walked in cities, which was on level ground for functional purposes rather than on uneven ground for its own sake. But she was fit enough for the climb, and she had good boots, and she was not in a hurry, which she had come to understand was the most important qualification for fell walking. The view from the top was the view she had imagined from the schoolroom window and the sitting room window across 3 weeks of looking at the fell from below. It was larger than she had imagined, which views from high ground usually were. The distance from the fell top to the furthest visible horizon, longer than the eye's experience of looking at the fell from below suggested it would be. Aldermoor was visible below and to the south, the stone cluster of it small and complete, the church and the green and the school building visible as distinct elements within the cluster. She sat on a flat stone near the summit and looked at the village. Miss Greenwood had been looking at this view for 30 years, not necessarily from this exact position. She did not know whether Miss Greenwood had climbed the fell, though the books suggested she had walked all parts of the parish, and the fell was part of the parish, but from the schoolroom window, from the sitting room, from wherever in and around the village her work and her life had taken her, she had been looking at Aldermoor from within it, part of the thing she was observing, which was different from observing it from outside. Edith had been here 3 weeks. She was still outside in some ways, the distance of the newcomer not yet fully reduced, the village still showing her more than it showed the people who had been in it long enough to have stopped seeing it as something to be shown. This would change. She understood it would change. The village would become familiar, and the school would become familiar, and she would stop noticing the things she was currently noticing with the particular sharpness of the newcomer's attention. She wanted to write down what she was noticing before that happened, not in the school ledger. This was not ledger material. In her own notebook, the one she had been filling with the things the children told her and the things she was learning about the school. She took the notebook from her coat pocket and wrote for an hour at the fell top, with the June view spread around her. She was into the 1860s by the end of June's second week. The books in the 1860s had a different quality from the earlier ones, not better, not worse, but different in the way that a person's observation changed over time when they had been applying it to the same material for 15 and then 20 years. The observation in the 1860s was less about discovery and more about depth, the entries returning to things that had been observed in the early volumes and finding in them a further layer that the earlier observation had not reached. Miss Greenwood had written, in the 1863 volume, "I have been watching the south corner of the schoolroom for 18 years. I know that corner as well as I know any corner in the world, the way the light moves through it in each month of the year, the way the wall has settled at a slightly different angle than the plumb line would have it, the crack in the plaster at approximately shoulder height that appeared in the winter of 1851 and has not grown since, the mark on the floor where generations of children have sat and fidgeted, and the sitting and fidgeting have left their trace in the wood. I know this corner, and yet I noticed something this October that I had not noticed before. The way the afternoon sun in October comes through the window at the angle that makes the dust in the air visible as a column of light, and within the column the dust moving in a specific pattern that I have been watching for 3 weeks now, and which I believe has to do with the way air moves in the room when the door is opened and closed. I have been in this room for 18 years, and I have not seen this before, or I have not attended to it. These may be the same thing." Edith read this and sat with it. She thought about what 18 years in one room would feel like. She had been in the Aldermoor schoolroom for 2 weeks. She had noticed perhaps a tenth of what was there to be noticed, she thought, and she had been paying careful attention by her own standards. 18 years of the same room, the crack in the plaster that appeared in 1851 and had not grown since. She looked at the schoolroom. She was reading in the schoolroom this evening, the sitting room's evening light not as good as the schoolroom's, and looked for the crack. It was there, at approximately shoulder height in the south corner, exactly as described. She went to it and looked at it closely. It had not grown. It was exactly the crack in the plaster that Miss Greenwood had mentioned in 1863, still present, still stable, a small specific fact about the building that had persisted from 1851 to 1876 without changing. 25 years. She was reading a description of this crack written 13 years ago, and she was looking at the same crack. She went back to the chair and continued reading. The 1860s volumes had a quality of certainty that the earlier volumes had been working toward, not the certainty of someone who had finished learning. The entries made clear that Miss Greenwood had not finished learning and did not expect to, but the certainty of someone who had found their footing and knew they were standing somewhere real. The village and the school and the children and the fell and the beck and the church and the families who had been here for generations and would continue, all of it known, all of it recorded, all of it valued in the specific way of someone who had found what they were looking for and had stayed. She visited Mrs. Cross again on a Thursday in the third week. The visit had become a Thursday habit, not a scheduled one. Nothing had been explicitly agreed, but she had gone the first Thursday and Mrs. Cross had been available and the conversation had been useful, and she had gone the second Thursday and found the same conditions, and the expectation of Thursday visiting had established itself with the naturalness of things that establish themselves through repetition rather than intention. She asked about the 1860s. She had been reading the books from those years and had found them different from the earlier ones, and wanted to know whether Mrs. Cross had noticed a change in Miss Greenwood in that period. Mrs. Cross considered this seriously, as she considered all questions about Miss Greenwood, not quickly, not dismissively, but with the attention of someone taking the question genuinely seriously and wanting to answer it as accurately as possible. She said, "In the 60s, Agnes was settled. That's the word I'd use. She'd been here long enough by then that she was part of the place rather than a visitor to it, if you understand me. She wasn't passing through anymore. She wasn't going anywhere." She said once, I think this was around 62 or 63, she said she had decided that this was the right life and she was going to live it properly. She said it in quite a matter-of-fact way, which was how she said most things, but I understood it as significant. People don't always decide to live the life they have, she decided. Edith thought about this. She thought about the difference between a life that was lived and a life that was decided to be lived, the element of intention in the second that might or might not be present in the first. She asked, did she have family? Did she ever wish she had gone somewhere else? Mrs. Cross was quiet. She said she had a brother in York. They were in correspondence. She visited once or twice. He visited here occasionally in the early years and less as the years went on. She didn't talk about wishing she had gone somewhere else. I don't know whether she ever thought it privately. You can't know that about a person, but she didn't express it, and she was not, in my experience, a person who suppressed what she felt. She felt what she felt, and she knew what she felt, and she generally said it when it was relevant to say it. I think she was content. Content. The word arrived in Edith with a particular resonance. She had not yet decided whether she was content in Aldermoor. She was engaged, That was the quality of these first weeks, the engagement with the school and the books and the village and the children, the quality of finding a great deal to attend to and attending to it fully. Engagement was not the same thing as content. Content implied something more settled, more permanent. She had not been here long enough for that. She thought about arriving at 42 and staying for 30 years. She had arrived at 36. If she stayed for 30 years, she would leave at 66, which seemed a very long time when stated numerically, and which she could not quite imagine. But Miss Greenwood presumably could not have imagined it either at 42. You did not imagine 30 years. You decided to stay, and then you stayed, and 30 years happened. She walked back to the school in the June evening. She taught the Beck lesson in the 4th week. She had been planning it since Joseph Hartley's observation in the 3rd week, had written several versions of it in her notebook, and had settled on an approach that she thought would work, beginning with the geography text's account of rivers and river systems, which was the standard curriculum, and then moving from the general to the specific, from the rivers of England to the specific river below the village, from what the book said to what the children knew. She had asked Joseph to be ready to explain the Beck to the class. She had asked him outside the school day, had spoken to him after class on a Monday, and asked whether he would be willing to tell the whole class what he had told her, and he had said yes, with the combined confidence and slight anxiety of a child who has been given an unexpected form of recognition and is not entirely certain what to do with it. He explained the Beck in the lesson with the same precision he had used with her, standing at the front of the class with the slight self-consciousness of someone who was used to being a pupil rather than the person standing at the front, but with clear knowledge informing everything he said. The other children listened with the quality of listening that she had come to recognize in this school as distinct from the quality of listening to the standard curriculum, more alert, more engaged, the recognition that what was being said was something they were connected to rather than something they were receiving from outside. Several of them added to what Joseph said. The girl beside him, Emma Carver, knew something about the Beck in winter that Joseph had not mentioned, the way it froze at the edges first and then toward the center, and the specific conditions under which it froze completely, which happened rarely, but had happened twice in her memory. An older boy, Daniel Marsh, knew about the fish in the upper reach in ways that complemented what Joseph knew about the lower reach. She wrote all of this in her notebook during the lesson, not obviously, the notebook beside the school register on her desk, the writing not interrupting the lesson but accompanying it. Afterward, she thought about Miss Greenwood's question about the 2 kinds of knowledge. She had not resolved the question, but she had found, in the Beck lesson, something like a practice, a way of holding both kinds of knowledge in the same lesson without requiring either to become the other. The geography text's account of rivers was true and useful. Joseph Hartley's account of Aldermoor Beck was also true and useful. They were true and useful in different ways, and the lesson had been able to contain both. She wrote this in her notebook in the evening, alongside the notes from the lesson itself. It was not a method she could describe precisely yet. It was more like the beginning of a method, the first articulation of something that would need many more lessons and many more notebooks before it had the form of something that could be described. She thought about the 30 volumes in the storage room and about Miss Greenwood arriving at this same territory in 1850 and continuing to work in it for 25 more years. She read the 1868 volume that evening. She entered the 1870s in the 4th week and felt the change immediately. It was not a dramatic change. The writing was the same writing, the same hand, the same economy, the same quality of careful, specific observation that had characterized all 30 volumes. But the 1870s volumes had something in them that the earlier volumes did not have in the same way, which was the quality of looking back as well as looking forward. Miss Greenwood had been at Aldermoor for 25 years by the time she wrote the 1870 volume, and 25 years meant that some of the children who had sat in the front bench when she arrived were now in their 30s and had children of their own, some of whom were now in the same school. The cycle had completed itself once and was completing itself again. She had written in the 1870 volume, "Thomas Carver was in the first row in 1845 when I arrived. He was 7 years old and he could not read. He learned to read here. He is 32 now, and his daughter Emma is 6, and she sat in the front row in September, and she can read already. Her mother has taught her at home, which is something this village does for some of its children and not others, and the reasons for which children are taught at home and which are not are complicated in the ways that things in a village are always complicated, involving the education and the inclination and the circumstances of the parents in combinations that I cannot always predict. Emma reads well. She is a different kind of learner from her father, who was slow to start and then quick once he had started. She is quick from the beginning. I remember her father's first year very clearly. I look at her and I think about the fact that I know something about her that she does not know, which is what her father was like at her age, and that this knowledge is entirely mine and will leave the world when I leave it. Edith read this and thought about what a teacher accumulated across 30 years, the knowledge of children who had grown and become parents, and whose children were now in the same school, the perspective that only time produced, the ability to look at Emma Carver and know something about her father at the same age that her father did not know about himself. She would not have this in the way that Miss Greenwood had it. She had arrived at 36 rather than 42, which gave her a few more potential years, but 30 years was still 30 years, and she was at the beginning of it rather than the middle. But she had the books. The books contained something of what Miss Greenwood had accumulated, and the books were here in the storage room, and she could read them. She had read about Emma Carver's father before she met Emma Carver. She knew something about the family that Emma did not know about herself, handed to her across years of observation that she had not herself conducted. This was an unusual form of knowing, not her own observation, but Miss Greenwood's, transmitted through the medium of these 30 volumes. She thought about what to do with this kind of knowing, how to hold it without imposing it on the children, without seeing them only through the lens of what had been written about their families, rather than what she was observing herself. The question was its own kind of answer. Miss Greenwood had been asking the same question in a different form for 30 years. She reached 1874 on a Wednesday evening at the end of the 5th week. And by 1874 she had read 29 of the 30 volumes, and the reading had given her something that she had not had when she arrived, which was a sense of Miss Greenwood not as an abstraction, but as a person, not a complete person. The books could not give her that, the books being one angle of observation of one person across 30 years, rather than the full account, but something more than she had had from the ledger alone, a particular kind of intelligence, a particular relationship to the place she had chosen and the work she had chosen, a particular way of holding the question of what a school could do and what it could not do. The 1874 volume was written in the same hand as all the others, but she noticed something in it that she had been noticing more in the later volumes, a slight loosening of the economy that had been so characteristic of the middle years. Not more words than necessary exactly, but more willingness to sit with something without moving on quickly. the entries occasionally staying in the same observation for longer than the earlier entries would have stayed, as though the observation had become valuable enough on its own terms that the urge to move to the next thing was less pressing. She had written in the summer entry of 1874, "I walked to the top of the fell this morning before school, which I have been doing less often than I did in the early years. I went up because of the light. There has been a particular quality of light here this June that I haven't seen in exactly this form before, though I've been here for 29 Junes. The light changes every year in ways that are not in the books. The light cannot be in the books. Books can describe light, but the description is not the light, and what I climbed the fell for this morning was the light itself, the fact of it, the way it was at 6 o'clock on this specific morning in this specific June. I am aware that I am 68 years old, and that the fell takes longer to climb than it used to, and that this is a calculation I will at some point have to make differently than I make it now. I am not at that point yet. I climbed the fell this morning, and I will climb it again before the summer is out." Edith set the book down. 68. She had not known Miss Greenwood's age. She had known that she had been at Aldermoor for 30 years when she left, and that she had arrived at 42, but she had not done the arithmetic. 68 when she wrote the 1874 volume, 69 when the entries stopped, in November 1875. She thought about climbing the fell at 68. She had climbed it at 36 and had found it, while not effortless, well within her capacity. 32 more years would change that calculation. Miss Greenwood had been right that the calculation would at some point need to be made differently. She had been right and had not yet made it differently. She was still climbing the fell at 68. Edith sat with this for a long time in the schoolroom chair, the June evening outside the windows, the fell visible in the northwest. Then she went to the storage room and took down the last volume. The 1875 volume was thinner than the others. She noticed this before she opened it, the spine showing fewer pages than the earlier volumes, the handmade binding pressed flat in the way of a book that is only partially filled. She had known this was coming. She had known from the ledger, from the entry that stopped on the 14th of November, that the 1875 volume would be incomplete, but knowing it in the abstract and holding the thinner volume in her hands were different experiences. She opened it. The 1875 volume began in September, as all the volumes began. The first entry was dated the 1st of September 1875, her 30th year of teaching at Aldermoor, which she noted in the first line in the same matter-of-fact way she noted everything, not with celebration or sentimentality, but with the simple recording of a fact. 30 years, the volume began. She read through September and October. The entries were the same, the observation, the recording, the seasonal movement through the school year. The children came back from the summer, and the September light came through the windows, and she noted what she noted. Some of the entries in September and October had a quality she had been noticing in the later volumes generally, the quality of looking back. The 30th anniversary of her arrival prompting entries that connected the present to the past in specific ways, finding the threads that ran from 1845 to 1875 through specific children and families and details of the school and the village. She had written, in the October entry, "I taught the father of the child I am now teaching. This has been true for some years, but the 30th year makes it more apparent to me. I have the beginning of the record, and I have the present, and I can see the line between them in a way I could not have seen it earlier. The village is not the same village it was in 1845. It is demonstrably different in several ways I could list if I chose to. And yet the continuity is what I feel most strongly. not the sameness, the continuity, which is different from sameness, which requires the change in order to be what it is. She turned to November. There were 4 November entries. The first 3 were in the usual form. The 4th, dated the 12th of November, 2 days before the last ledger entry, was shorter than usual and different in its quality, in a way she could not precisely name. The writing was the same, the observation was accurate, but something in the tone was slightly different from all the preceding entries, a quality of something being said that was not quite the same as the quality of something being noted. She had written, "I have been thinking about what this record is, not what it was intended to be. I knew that from the beginning, or thought I did, though I understand it differently now, what it has become. It has become, I think, a record of the fact that this school existed and that I taught in it, and that certain things were worth attending to, and that the attending produced something, though I could not say precisely what. Someone will come after me. I do not know when or who. I hope the books are useful to whoever comes. I hope they say something that cannot be said in the official record." The 4 November entries ended on the 12th. The rest of the 1875 volume was blank. Edith sat at the desk with the open book and the blank pages. She sat with the blank pages for a long time. They were not threatening blank pages, not the blankness of something that should have been filled and was not the blankness of failure or abandonment. They were simply blank in the way that a book that has not yet been written is blank, the unmarked pages existing in the condition of potential rather than deficiency. But they were also the end of something. The 1875 volume stopped on the 12th of November and did not continue, and the next person who opened the volume would be her, arriving in June 1876 with the school's new year ahead of her and the 30 volumes behind her. The blank pages were the space between Miss Greenwood's end and her own beginning. She thought about what Miss Greenwood had written on the 12th. "I hope the books are useful to whoever comes. I hope they say something that cannot be said in the official record." They had said something. She was not certain she could articulate precisely what they had said, but they had said something that the ledger had not said, and that the schoolroom itself had not said, something that came specifically from the act of 30 years of attentive writing in 1 volume per year, each volume adding to the previous ones in the way that observation added when it was sustained and consistent. She thought about what to do with the blank pages. The most obvious thing was to continue the volume, to write the 1876 entries in the same format, in the same kind of book, as a continuation of what had been started in 1845 and had run to 1875 and had stopped, a 30th year continuation, the blank pages of the last volume filled and the record extended. But she was not Miss Greenwood. She was a different teacher with a different background and a different set of observations and a different relationship to this place, which relationship was currently 38 days old. The gap between November 1875 and June 1876 was real. She could not fill in the blank pages as though she had been here. She had not been here. She thought about starting a new volume for 1876, a fresh book, her own format, her own beginning. The 30 existing volumes would remain as they were, Miss Greenwood's record, and the 1876 volume would begin a new sequence. But this felt wrong in a different way, not because she needed to pretend she had been here. She could simply acknowledge in the first entry that she was new and was continuing from where the previous record had stopped, but because starting fresh implied a break that was not how she understood it. The school was the same school. The children in some cases were the same children. The crack in the plaster at shoulder height in the south corner was the same crack. The fell was the same fell. The continuity was real, and a fresh start denied it. She sat with the blank pages and the two options and found, as she had found when she read the 1845 volume on her first evening, that there was a third option she had not initially considered. She could write in this volume. She could fill the blank pages, not as though she had been here in November and December and January and February and March and April and May. She had not been here then, but from where she was, in June 1876, writing about June 1876, the blank pages becoming not a gap, but the space that a new beginning required in order to begin from where the old ending had stopped. The continuity, not the sameness, the continuity. She told Mrs. Cross on Thursday. She had not planned to tell anyone. The decision felt like something she needed to make on her own and then simply act on, rather than consult about. But she had been going to Thursday visits for 5 weeks now, and the habit had become something she valued, and when she sat across from Mrs. Cross at the kitchen table with the tea between them, she found herself describing the blank pages and the decision before she had quite chosen to. Mrs. Cross listened without interrupting. This was characteristic. She did not interrupt things that needed to be said continuously, and this was one of them. And when Edith finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that indicated thought rather than the absence of response. She said, "Agnes said once, this was perhaps 20 years ago, I don't remember the specific occasion. She said that the books were not for her. She said she knew they were hers in the sense of being made by her, but they were not for her. She was writing them for the school. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and I understood what she meant, though I didn't think about it much at the time. I've thought about it since." Edith said, "For the school, meaning for whoever came after her." Mrs. Cross said, "For the school, meaning for the school, for the thing itself." She was adding to the school what the school needed and what the official record couldn't provide. Whether anyone read it or not was secondary, I think, though she hoped someone would. The primary thing was the record existing. Edith thought about this. The primary thing was the record existing, not the reading of the record, not the use of the record, but the fact of the record, the writing down of what was worth writing down, independent of whether anyone received it. She had been receiving it. She had read 30 volumes, and she had received something from them, and what she had received had already changed how she taught and how she observed and how she understood this specific school in this specific village. So the secondary thing had happened and had mattered. But Mrs. Cross was right, that the primary thing was the record itself, the existence of it, the fact that someone had sat down every year for 30 years and written what could not be written in the ledger. She was going to continue the record. She was not going to pretend she was Miss Greenwood. She was going to write as herself, in her own hand and from her own observation, continuing from where the blank pages began. She would write the June entry first, and the entry would acknowledge that she was new, and that the previous record had stopped in November, and that she was beginning from here. And then she would continue, one entry at a time, in whatever form seemed right for what she was observing. Mrs. Cross said she would have been glad of that. Not sentimental glad, practically glad. She would have thought it was the correct thing to do, and she would have been satisfied. Edith said she hoped so. She walked back to the school through the June evening and stood for a moment outside the door before going in. The fell was in the long evening light to the northwest, the June light staying later than any other months, the sky still pale above the fell top at 9 o'clock in the evening. She went inside and lit the lamp and took the 1875 volume from the storage room and opened it to the first blank page after the 12th of November entry. She picked up the pen. She wrote for 2 hours. Not the first entry that came first and was short, the acknowledgement of the gap and the new beginning. She wrote, June 1876. I am the new teacher at Aldermoor. I arrived on the 1st of June. The previous 30 volumes of this record were written by Miss A. Greenwood, who taught here from 1845 to 1875. I have read all 30 volumes. I intend to continue the record in this volume and in subsequent volumes. The form may be different from Miss Greenwood's form because I am a different person with different observation, but the intention is the same, to record what the official record does not contain. This was the first entry. It was short because she wanted it to be precise rather than long, the acknowledgement of the transition requiring less space than the transition itself. Then she wrote the second entry, the June entry proper, which was what she had been observing and thinking and understanding across the 5 weeks since her arrival, and which she had been accumulating in her notebook in the way that Miss Greenwood had accumulated her own observation in the volumes. She wrote about the fell and the rooks and the weather method that Thomas Birch had explained. She wrote about the beck and Joseph Hartley's observation. She wrote about Mary Baines in the front row with her complete unblinking attention. She wrote about the south corner and the crack in the plaster that was still there from 1851. She wrote about what she had understood from reading the 30 volumes about the kind of attention the school required and the kind of relationship between the two kinds of knowledge, the book's knowledge and the village's knowledge, that a teacher in this school needed to hold. She wrote about Mrs. Cross saying the primary thing was the record existing, and about what she had understood from this. She wrote without editing, the first draft being the version she would keep. She understood from reading Miss Greenwood's 30 volumes that the books had never been edited, each volume being the writing as it had come, the corrections being the corrections of thought in process rather than revisions after the fact. The form required this. A polished version would have been a different thing, a more considered thing, and the consideration would have lost something that the immediacy preserved. She filled 8 pages. When she stopped, she read back through what she had written and found it to be approximately right, not perfect. She was not attempting to be perfect. She was attempting to be accurate and honest and attentive in the same way that the 30 preceding volumes had been accurate and honest and attentive. She was not Miss Greenwood, and the writing showed this, the observation and the expression being shaped by a different person with a different history and a different relationship to the place. But it was the record. It was the continuation of the record. She closed the volume carefully and returned it to the storage room and placed it in its position at the end of the sequence, next to the 1874 volume, the thinnest one, slightly less thin now than it had been this morning. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The fell was dark against the June sky in the northwest, and the village was quiet in the way that villages were quiet at this hour, which was the quiet of a place where most people were asleep, and the place itself was simply continuing to be what it was, as it had been continuing to be what it was for a very long time. The school had its summer quality by the end of the 5th week. She had heard about this quality from the children themselves, who had mentioned in various ways and various lessons that June was, when the school was at its most itself, not because the teaching was better in June, but because the light was best in June, and the light determined a great deal about what the schoolroom felt like from inside it. The south windows in June admitted light from early morning to late afternoon, and the light moved through the room in a way that the winter light, which was lower and shorter, did not. The room was warm without the fire, which was its own kind of relief from the months when the fire was necessary, but had its costs in terms of air quality and the particular fog that coal fires produced. She had been paying attention to the light, not because she had not paid attention to light in other schools. It was a practical concern, the light affecting the children's ability to see their work. But because Miss Greenwood's 30 volumes had made her more aware of the specific quality of light in this specific building at specific times of the year. The October light was different from the June light. She would see the October light in its own time, and she would see it differently because she had read about it. The children were well into their rhythm. The 14 had established themselves as a group in the particular way of school groups that were small enough that everyone knew everyone, and the dynamics between individuals were visible in a way they were not in larger groups. She was learning the dynamics, who worked well beside whom, who needed more space, who needed more encouragement, who had already established ways of learning that she needed to work with rather than against. She had a Thursday afternoon walk with 3 of the older children along the beck. Not a lesson exactly. She had described it to them as a looking walk, explaining that she wanted to see the beck that Joseph had described to the class and wanted them to show it to her rather than her telling them about it. They had received this with a slight uncertainty that children received instructions that were different from the standard forms of instruction, and had then proceeded to show her the beck with the thoroughness that children showed things when they understood that their specific knowledge was genuinely wanted rather than being merely tolerated. She wrote it all in the notebook, not the official version for the volume. She had understood from reading Miss Greenwood that the notebook was the gathering place and the volume was the distillation, the final form that what had been gathered took after it had been lived with for long enough to be understood rather than merely observed. She would write the July entry from the June notebook. The afternoon by the beck was what Miss Greenwood had described in the 1863 volume when she wrote about paying attention to a corner of the schoolroom for 18 years and still finding something new in October. It was the attention itself that mattered, not the discovery. Discovery was the occasional result of sustained attention, not its purpose. The purpose was the attending, the showing up, the daily willingness to look at the same things again and find them still worth looking at. She was beginning to understand this not as an idea, but as a practice. July arrived, and with it the first truly hot week of the summer. The heat changed the school's character. The south windows in July admitted heat as well as light, and by afternoon the schoolroom was warm in a way that affected the children's concentration, the youngest especially, whose attention shortened in proportion to the temperature in ways that were not their fault and that the curriculum did not account for. She adjusted the afternoon lessons accordingly, moving the most demanding work to the mornings and using the afternoons for things that required less sustained mental effort. The drawing work, the singing practice, the outdoor lessons she had begun conducting when the weather permitted, which combined the curriculum's geography and natural history requirements with the children's knowledge of the parish in ways she was still refining. She visited Mrs. Cross on a Thursday in July and found her in the garden again, doing what she had been doing when they met, something to the rose bush that evidently required ongoing attention across the summer months. Mrs. Cross said July, and then invited her in without further discussion, the Thursday visits having become established enough that ceremony was not required. She asked about the end. Not in so many words. She did not ask what Mrs. Cross knew about November 1875 and how it had been, but she asked, when Miss Greenwood left, how did it happen? Mrs. Cross sat down on the kitchen bench and was quiet for a moment. She said, "Agnes got ill in October, not dramatically. She didn't do anything dramatically, Agnes. She got ill in the slow way of someone who has been managing their health for a long time and has reached a point where managing it is no longer sufficient. She kept teaching through October. She stopped in November when she could not manage the classroom anymore." She said. Mrs. Cross paused, remembering. She said she was sorry about the children. She said the children were in the middle of their year and she was sorry to leave them in the middle. Edith said, "Did she know she wasn't coming back?" Mrs. Cross said, "She knew she was probably not coming back." She said probably. She was in York with her brother by December. She died in March. She had been dead for 3 months when Edith arrived in June. The school had been empty from November to June, managed intermittently, the children going what had to be an incomplete year. She had not fully understood the gap until now. She said, "Did she know about the books? Did she say anything about leaving them?" Mrs. Cross said, "She mentioned them the last time I saw her, which was a few days before she went to York. She said she was leaving the books in the storage room, and she hoped whoever came next would find them useful and would carry on." She said it without sentimentality, the way she said most things. She said she hoped, but she didn't know. The hope had been fulfilled. Edith had found the books on her second evening and had recognized immediately what they were. She had been reading them for 7 weeks. She walked back to the school in the July afternoon and went to the storage room and looked at the 31 volumes in their sequence, 30 of Miss Greenwood's and one that was now partly hers, the blank pages filling. She would write the July entry this evening from the July notebook. She would write about the heat and the adjustment to the afternoon lessons and the outdoor work and the children in July and what July said about the school that June had not said. She took the class out to the fell edge on a clear morning in the 3rd week of July. This was not in the curriculum. She had not found anything in the curriculum that corresponded to taking 14 children up the lane to the point where the village ended and the fell began, and asking them to stand there and look and then tell her what they saw. But she had found in the 30 volumes a principle that she was applying, which was that what the children knew was worth bringing into the school, and what the school could do was help them find the form in which what they knew could be spoken and shared. She had prepared them for it. The previous Friday she had told them what they were going to do on Monday morning, that they were going to go to the fell edge and that she was going to ask each of them to tell the group one thing they could see, not name, not identify according to the geography text, see what they actually saw when they looked at the fell in July. They stood at the boundary where the lane met the open fell, and she asked Mary Baines first, because Mary was in the front row, and it seemed right. Mary said, "There are flowers I don't know the name of. They're yellow. My Nan calls them something, but I don't remember what." She wrote this down. The 14 children told her 14 things. Some were botanical, some were about the weather. One was about a stone wall on the upper fell that Daniel Marsh said his great-grandfather had built. Joseph Hartley told her something about the fell at this time of year specifically, the way the grass changed from the lower sections to the higher in July, and what this indicated about the soil and the water table, which his father had explained to him, and which his father's father had explained to his father. She wrote all 14 things down. She said, "Thank you. Now I'm going to tell you the names of the yellow flowers, because names are useful, and then we're going to go back to the schoolroom and I'm going to show you where this fell is in the geography of England, because that's useful too." She looked up the flowers in the natural history text that evening. They were common bird's foot trefoil, and they were yellow, and they were in full bloom in July on fell ground of this type, and Mary's Nan called them bacon and eggs, which Edith also wrote down, because the local name was as real as the scientific name, and more likely to be used. She wrote the outdoor lesson in full detail in the notebook, and then began the July entry in the volume, sitting at the desk in the July evening with the window open and the fell visible to the northwest in the long, slow light. She wrote about the children at the fell edge. She wrote about Mary Baines and the yellow flowers with their local name. She wrote about the stone wall on the upper fell that Daniel Marsh's great-grandfather had built. She wrote about what it felt like to stand at the boundary between the village and the fell with 14 children and ask them to say what they saw. It felt, she wrote, like being in the right place for the right work. This is the observation I have been building towards since June, and I do not know whether I would have been able to make it without the 30 volumes, which showed me what this school was before I arrived in it. She filled a third of the 1875 volume by August. The blank pages were filling in the way that blank pages filled when you wrote in them regularly, not quickly, not with the haste of someone trying to complete something, but steadily, the entries accumulating across the weeks. July's entries occupied 12 pages. August was beginning. She had understood by August that the form she was using was different from Miss Greenwood's form in certain ways that she had not initially intended, but that were now simply the form, the natural expression of a different person doing a similar thing in a similar place. Miss Greenwood's entries tended toward the particular, the specific observation of a specific child or a specific feature of the school on a specific day. Her own entries tended to be more reflective, the specific observation present, but often accompanied by a broader consideration of what the observation meant. This was not better or worse. It was different. She was not trying to write like Miss Greenwood. She was trying to write like herself, which was what the record required, a continuation that was also a transformation, the new writing growing from the old ground in the way that things grew when the ground had been prepared well over a long period. Mrs. Cross had commented on this without knowing the details when she said in one of the Thursday visits, "Agnes would have liked you." She said it not as a compliment exactly, or not only as a compliment, but as an observation. She said she thought they would have found each other useful. Edith had thought about this afterward, finding each other useful, not finding each other pleasant, though she thought from the 30 volumes that she would have found Miss Greenwood pleasant in the specific way of someone whose intelligence and commitment made them genuinely good company. But useful was the word Mrs. Cross had chosen, and Mrs. Cross chose words carefully. She wrote in the August entry, "I have been here 10 weeks. This is long enough to have moved from the newcomer's attention, which is acute and wide but surface, to something more layered, where the observation goes both wider and deeper, the wider being the range of things I am now attending to, and the deeper being the quality of attention I am bringing to things I have been observing for several weeks. I notice things now that I did not notice in June. Some of these things were there in June, and I was not seeing them. Some of them are new. The season has changed, and the school has changed with it, and the village has changed with it, and I am now observing August rather than June." She had written about August specifically in the 1845 volume, the first August at Aldermoor, when Miss Greenwood had been here for less than a year, and had written about the summer sessions with the quality of observation she had already established in her first months. The August in 1845 and the August in 1876 were different Augusts in different years with different children, but they were both Augusts in the same school, in the same village, and some of what could be said about them was the same. She thought about what the 31st volume would look like beside the 30 that preceded it on the shelf, thinner than most of them, being a continuation of 1875 rather than a full-year volume. She would start a new volume for 1877, the summer before the autumn term, the preparation and the planning that September required. That volume would be the first one entirely her own. August moved towards September, and the school moved with it. The summer sessions reduced in the last 2 weeks of August, the agricultural calendar beginning to make its claims on the older children's time in a way it did not in other months. She had seen this coming from the records. Miss Greenwood had noted it every year, the August attendance declining and the September attendance recovering as the harvest requirements shifted and the school year formally began again. She used the reduced August attendance to reorganize the schoolroom, not dramatically. She did not want to change the essential character of the room, which was the character that 30 years of use had given it, and which was not hers to alter without reason. But she rearranged the shelf, the texts in a slightly different order, reflecting her own understanding of how she was using them. She brought in 2 books she had ordered from Harrogate, a natural history of the Yorkshire moors that was more specific to this landscape than the geography text, and an arithmetic reference that she thought was clearer in its explanations of the methods the older children were working on. She also, over the course of 2 afternoons, read through the notebook she had been keeping since June, not to revise it. She had not revised anything she had written in the volume, consistent with what she had understood about the form, but to see what the 10 weeks had produced when read in sequence, the notebook entries being the raw material from which the volume entries had been distilled. What the notebook produced when read in sequence was something she had not seen when she was writing the individual entries, which was a sense of her own development, the arc of 10 weeks, the movement from the newcomer's wide acute surface attention to the layered attention she had described in the August entry. She could see herself learning the school, week by week. She could see the understanding accumulating. This was what Miss Greenwood's 30 volumes showed when read in sequence, which was the form she had read them in, the accumulation of 30 years, not 30 years all present simultaneously, but 30 years in sequence, each year built on what came before. She was 10 weeks into her own sequence. She had a great deal ahead of her if she stayed. If she stayed. She had not made the decision to stay permanently. She had come on a temporary posting, which could be made permanent if both parties agreed, and she had been here for 10 weeks, and she had not yet been asked, and had not yet been required to decide. The decision was somewhere ahead of her, in the autumn or the winter or the spring, and she was not making it now. But she knew, reading the notebook in August, that the decision she would make would not be the same decision she would have made in June, which would not have been a fully informed decision because she had not yet understood what she was being asked to decide about. She understood better now. She looked at the 31 volumes on the storage room shelf, 30 of Miss Greenwood's, the last one partly hers. She thought about what 31 would become if she stayed. September was coming. The full school year was coming. The autumn with its different light and different children and different rhythm. Miss Greenwood had written about all of it for 30 years. There was a great deal in the 30 volumes that she had not yet had the experience to fully understand, that she would understand better when she had lived through the seasons she had only read about. She closed the notebook and went to prepare the schoolroom for September. The 1st of September fell on a Friday in 1876. She would begin the new school year on Monday, giving herself the weekend for final preparation. On the evening of the 31st of August, she sat in the schoolroom with the lamp lit and thought about what she had. She had 14 children, names known to her, abilities partially understood, what each of them brought from outside the schoolroom, partially catalogued in the notebook across the summer. She had the curriculum, which was what it was, and which she had been working with for 8 years and could deliver competently. She had the schoolroom, which she now knew well, the morning light and the afternoon light and the September light that she had not yet seen, but that Miss Greenwood had described in 6 separate volumes across 30 years, each year's September slightly different from the others, the light never precisely the same, though always recognizably September. She had the 30 volumes. She had Mrs. Cross. She had begun a volume of her own. She thought about what Miss Greenwood had arrived with at 42, and what she had built across 30 years, and what she had left in the storage room. She thought about arriving at 36 and having access to the 30 volumes from the beginning, which Miss Greenwood had not had, because Miss Greenwood was the beginning. She had started from nothing and built from nothing and left what she had built for whoever came next, which was Edith. The gift was considerable. She had understood this intellectually when she first found the volumes, but 10 weeks of reading and teaching and Thursday visits and fell walks and Beck lessons had made it concrete. She was not starting from nothing. She was starting from 30 years of someone else's careful work, which was an unusual position for a new teacher, but was the position she had. She would be 20 years into her own record if she stayed, before she caught up to the point at which Miss Greenwood had been when she wrote the 1865 volume, which was already deep into the understanding that long observation produced. She would not catch up in any meaningful sense. Miss Greenwood's observation was her own and could not be transferred to Edith, only read. But she could build from it. She could know things about the school and the village and the children and the families that she would not have known without the 30 volumes, and this knowledge could be incorporated into her own accumulation. She was building on someone else's foundations. This was not unusual. Most building was on someone else's foundations, the village itself being the most obvious example, the stone walls and the church and the green having been built on ground that had been used before the people who built on it. What was unusual was that the foundations were so explicitly available, written down, 1 volume per year, on the storage room shelf. She would write the September entry when September had given her something to write about. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the August dark of the bedroom with the fell to the northwest and the village quiet around the school building and the 31 volumes in the storage room and the 32nd volume waiting. They arrived on Monday morning as they had arrived in June, at 8 o'clock as instructed, with the particular quality of having returned from somewhere they had been and adjusting to being back. The summer had done what summers did to children, which was visible in the ways they carried themselves and the things they said, and the particular quality of September energy, which was different from June energy, in ways she was beginning to be able to articulate. She had read about September energy in the volumes. Miss Greenwood had noted it consistently, the children returning with what the summer had given them and bringing it into the schoolroom in ways that were not always convenient for the curriculum, but that were real, the summer being something that had actually happened to them and that they had not entirely left behind simply because the school year had resumed. She began differently than she had begun in June. In June, she had asked each child to tell her one thing they knew that she didn't know. In September, she asked each child to tell her one thing that had happened in the summer that they wanted to remember. Mary Baines said, "My Nan taught me to braid a corn dolly. She taught me the names of all the different kinds." Thomas Birch said, "I watch the weather from the fell every evening for 6 weeks. I have it written down." He produced a notebook from his coat pocket, small, well used, pages dense with his neat, careful writing, and held it up. She looked at Thomas Birch's notebook. He had been keeping a record of his fell observations, 6 weeks of nightly watching, written down in the same format each entry. She said, "May I borrow this? I'll return it tomorrow." He looked uncertain and then said yes. She taught the morning's reading and arithmetic and geography and kept Thomas's notebook on the desk and did not open it during school hours. After the children left, she sat at the desk and opened it. 42 entries: date, time, cloud conditions, wind direction, the fall temperature as best he could estimate it, the rook behavior, the predicted weather for the following day, and then the following day's entry, a notation of whether the prediction had been correct. He had a success rate of approximately 70%, which he had calculated himself and noted on the back page. She held the notebook and thought about Thomas Birch and his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, and what this particular kind of careful, patient, observational knowledge looked like when it was written down by an 11-year-old who had decided to write it down. She read through the 42 entries and then sat for a long time. She wrote in her own notebook, "Thomas Birch has been keeping a weather record from fell observations, 6 weeks. He has derived a predictive method with approximately 70% accuracy. He did not think of this as unusual. He thought of it as simply the thing he was doing over the summer. The knowledge his family has accumulated across generations has produced in him." October arrived, and with it the light that Miss Greenwood had written about in the 1863 volume, the dust in the air made visible as a column of afternoon sunlight through the south window, the column moving as the sun moved, the particular quality of October light that was different from September or November. She had been waiting for this, not impatiently. She had not been counting days, but she had read about October and she knew it would come, and when it came she would see what Miss Greenwood had described, and the seeing would be different because she had read about it than if she had simply encountered it without preparation. The light arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of October, in the late afternoon when the sun was low and coming through the south windows at the angle that only October and perhaps March produced. She was at the front of the room explaining something to the arithmetic group, and she saw the column appear above the children's heads, and she stopped mid-sentence and looked at it. The children looked at her and then looked in the direction she was looking. She said, "Do you see that?" They looked at the column of dust-lit light, and most of them nodded. Several of them had clearly seen it before. It was an annual phenomenon or something close to annual, and children who had been in the school for multiple years would have encountered it at least once before. She said, "Who has seen this before?" 6 hands went up. She said, "Who can tell me what makes it happen?" No one immediately answered. She waited. Then Emma Carver said, "The sun is low in October. My mam says October light is different from summer light." She said, "That's right. And the dust in the air. Do you see the dust in the light?" They could see it when she pointed it out. The particles of chalk and old wood and whatever other fine material the schoolroom had suspended in its air across the years, all of it made visible by the specific angle of the October light. She described what she was seeing. She described it in the terms she had available, which were not scientific terms exactly, but the terms of someone who had been paying careful attention and had found language that approximated what the attention had produced. The children listened with the quality of attention she recognized now, the alert engagement that came when what was being said was connected to what they could directly observe rather than to what was on a page. She wrote about it that evening. She wrote about the column of light and Emma Carver and the children's varied responses and what it meant to have read Miss Greenwood's 1863 description and then to have been present for the 1876 version of the same event. She wrote, "Seeing the thing you have read about is different from seeing the thing without having read about it. I am not certain whether it is better or worse. It is more layered. The October light in the schoolroom was the October light in the schoolroom, a specific event on a specific afternoon, and it was also the October light that Agnes Greenwood had noticed in 1863 and described in words that I had read. I saw both simultaneously. I am still thinking about what that means." November came, and with it the particular quality of November light that was not the absence of October's light, but a different kind of presence, lower, shorter, the mornings darker and the afternoons briefer, and the schoolroom requiring the lamp earlier in the day. She had been teaching at Aldermoor for 5 months. The 15th of October, when one new pupil arrived, had become the 15th of November, when everyone was present and the year was in its working rhythm. She visited Mrs. Cross on a Thursday in November and said, "I want to ask you something." Mrs. Cross said, "Ask then." She said, "When Miss Greenwood was writing the volumes and you knew she was writing them, did you ever wonder whether she should tell someone, whether the knowledge should be more available, more official?" Mrs. Cross considered this. She said, "Agnes thought about this. I know she thought about it because she mentioned it once, in the middle years, I think. She said she had considered whether the books should be given to the parish or to the school board or somewhere like that. She decided against it. She said the official record was already keeping what the official record kept, and the books were keeping what the official record didn't keep, and if she made the books official they would become part of the official record and would lose the quality that made them worth keeping. She said the books needed to be unofficial in order to be what they were." Edith thought about this. The books as unofficial, not hidden, not secret, simply not official, kept in the storage room rather than filed with the board, available to whoever came to the school and found them as she had found them, without being required by any institution to exist. She said, "Do you think she was right?" Mrs. Cross said, "I think she was right for her. Whether it's right in general I couldn't say. The books exist, and you've read them, and you're continuing them, and they've been useful to you, and they'll be useful to whoever comes after you, if you continue them. That's what Agnes hoped for. Whether they should have been official or not is a question I'm not well placed to answer." Edith walked back to the school through the November afternoon, which was closing toward dark earlier than October had closed. She had the lamp going by 4 o'clock now, which would continue through December and January and into February before the days began to recover. She sat at the desk in the November lamplight and wrote in the volume. She wrote about the November light and the November quality of the schoolroom and the children in November and what November said about the school year at this stage of it. She wrote about Mrs. Cross's account of Miss Greenwood's thinking about the official and unofficial records. She wrote, "I agree with her. The books are what they are because they are not required to be anything official. The freedom of the unofficial is the freedom to record what official records do not have room for, and this is precisely their value. If I file this volume with the school board, it becomes part of the official record, and it is no longer this. I will keep it here in the storage room beside the 30 that came before it. Whoever comes after me will find it as I found them." The lamp burned on the desk. The fell was invisible in the November dark to the northwest. The school was quiet around her. December came, and with it the final weeks of the school year. The children had the particular quality of December children, which was partly the tiredness of a year that was finishing, and partly the anticipation of the break ahead, and partly the particular December light that did something to energy that was not describable precisely, but was observable in any classroom she had taught in. She managed this by reducing the intensity of the formal curriculum work and increasing the things that the children found more sustaining in their attention. The singing they did on Friday afternoons, the drawing work that she had incorporated into the natural history lessons, the storytelling that she had begun on Thursday mornings as an extension of the literacy work. The storytelling had been Mary Baines's idea, or something close to it. She had asked, in October, whether she could tell the class about her grandmother making the corn dolly, and Edith had said yes, and the telling had been so effective, Mary's grandmother's method described in Mary's 6-year-old precision and authority, that she had incorporated it into the Thursday morning practice. Each week a different child told the class something their family knew. The quality of the telling had been consistently high in the way that children's telling was high when the subject was something they genuinely knew rather than something they had been told to know. She had recorded all of it in the notebook. The notebook was full, and she had started a second one. She wrote the December entry on the last Friday before the holiday, not a long entry. December's entry in Miss Greenwood's volumes had tended toward the shorter, the year's conclusion being marked, but not extensively. She wrote about the December quality of the school and the children and the light. She wrote about the first year. She wrote, "I have been here 7 months. I have taught a full school year from June to December. I have read 30 volumes, and I have added substantially to the 31st, and I have 2 notebooks full of material for the volumes ahead. I have climbed the fell 4 times and walked the full length of the beck twice. I know the children's names, and I know approximately what each of them brings from outside the schoolroom, and I know enough about the village to understand the context within which the school exists, which is different from what I understood in June. What I don't know is very large and will remain large for a long time. I will not know what Miss Greenwood knew after 30 years. I will know something different after 30 years, something that is mine rather than hers, though it will have grown from what she left and will not be separable from it. I intend to continue." She closed the volume and put it back on the shelf in the storage room. 31 volumes, 29 of them entirely Miss Greenwood's, 1 of them entirely hers, 1 of them shared, begun in Miss Greenwood's hand in September 1875 and continued in her own from June 1876, the blank pages filled, the record unbroken. She locked the school and walked into the December village, which was quiet in the way of a village at the end of a year, the work done for now, the fields resting, the houses lit from within against the early dark. The fell was a dark shape to the northwest against a sky that still held the last of the December afternoon. She had learned to read the clouds. She was not as good at it as Thomas Birch yet, but she was better than she had been in June. She would come back in January, and that is where we leave Edith Shaw tonight. Walking through the December village in the early dark of the year's last days, the school locked behind her, the fell to the northwest, the houses of Aldermoor lit from within, with the particular warmth of houses that know winter and have made their preparations and are now simply being what they are through the cold months. The school is as she left it, the schoolroom with its benches and its blackboard and its books on the shelf and the crack in the plaster at shoulder height in the south corner that has been there since 1851 and has not grown. The teacher's desk with the new ledger and the pen and the careful entries of 7 months in her handwriting. the attendance and the lessons and the weather and the children, the official record proceeding as official records proceeded, and in the storage room, on the shelves, 31 volumes, 30 of Miss Greenwood's, the earliest from 1845 and the latest stopping in November 1875, on a page that had been the last thing she wrote before the illness that took her from the school and eventually from Aldermoor entirely, and one volume shared in 1875's spine holding both women's handwriting, the older and neater entries giving way to the newer, fuller ones, the blank pages filled, the record continuing without a break. The 32nd volume is in the second desk drawer, blank, waiting for January. Sleep now. The school at Aldermoor will keep through the winter as it has kept through every winter since it was built. The stone walls doing what Yorkshire stone walls did through the cold months, which was to hold the warmth of what had been inside them and release it slowly and provide against the wind and the frost and the rain, the particular solidity of a building that was made to be here and has been here long enough that it has become part of what here means. In January the children will come back. Mary Baines will sit in the front bench and attend with her whole face as she has been attending since September. Thomas Birch will continue his fell observations and his notebook will be there on the desk if she asks to see it. Emma Carver will read with the fluency that her mother taught her at home and that the school has continued to develop. The light in January will be low and the mornings will be cold and the fire will be lit before the children arrive, and in the evenings, after the children have gone and the schoolroom is quiet, she will sit at the desk or in the chair by the window and open the second notebook and write down what the day has given her, the small specific things, the things the official record does not contain, the things that will become the 32nd volume and then the 33rd, accumulating as attention accumulated when it was sustained and honest, year by year, the record growing. The fell is dark to the northwest, and the village is quiet, and the 31 volumes are on their shelf. Rest well.